You don't cry at first. That's what the nurse notes in the chart. 8 pounds, 4 ounces, completely silent for 3 seconds before the room fills with sound. What the chart doesn't note, what no birth record anywhere will ever note, is that somewhere in a glass tower in Zurich, a position rebalances. A family office algorithm reads a new name added to a trust document and shifts 11 figures across 4 asset classes before your umbilical cord is cut. You haven't opened your eyes yet. You're already a market event. That's the first thing you need to understand about what $500 billion actually means at this scale. It isn't a number sitting in an account somewhere. There is no account. There is no single vault, no spreadsheet with one very long row. What you were born into is a system, a living, breathing, legally distributed organism spread across dozens of jurisdictions, hundreds of entities, and generations of deliberate architecture designed specifically so that no government, no court, no journalist, and no single catastrophe can touch all of it at once. Here's what the 500 billion actually looks like from the inside. There's a family office, which is essentially a private investment bank that exists solely to manage your family's affairs. It employs portfolio managers, tax attorneys, estate planners, risk analysts, and people whose entire job is to know what the other people are doing. Beneath that sits a web of trusts, some revocable, some irrevocable, some dynasty trusts structured to last 100 years past your death. Then there are the operating companies, the ones that actually make things or move things or own the infrastructure that other companies depend on. Logistics networks, regional utilities, agricultural land in 3 countries. A media holding nobody outside the industry tracks by name. And layered under all of that are the passive positions, minority stakes in private equity funds, sovereign debt instruments, real estate held through shell entities registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands and Luxembourg. You don't inherit a fortune. You inherit a filing cabinet the size of a continent. The privacy isn't an accident. It's the entire design. The entities are stacked specifically to minimize what has to be disclosed publicly. A family trust doesn't file earnings reports. A limited liability company registered through a nominee structure doesn't put your surname on the door. The operating companies that do have public-facing names are held several layers removed from anything with your family's name on it. You could spend a decade as a financial journalist trying to map the edges of it and still not find the center. That's not paranoia. That's just what money that old looks like when it's been managed carefully. Visibility is a liability at this scale, and your family learned that lesson before your grandparents were born. The first real power you inherit isn't money, not directly. It's optionality. Before you turn 18, before you sign a single document or sit in a single boardroom, the system is already working on your behalf in ways you'll only understand later. You are enrolled in schools where your classmates' families own the industries you'll one day operate inside. The networks form before you understand what networks are. You sit next to the future finance minister of a country you've never visited. You play lacrosse with the kid whose father runs the sovereign wealth fund that will anchor your first private deal. The deal flow starts arriving in your direction a decade before you're qualified to evaluate it, and by the time you are qualified, you're already standing at the front of the line everyone else spent 20 years trying to find. Compounding doesn't just happen to money, it happens to access. Here's the part that surprises most people when they actually think it through. At 500 billion, you are not liquid, not even close. The number sounds like infinite spending power, and in theory it is, but in practice almost none of it converts cleanly to cash without consequence. The controlling stake in a logistics conglomerate that anchors the portfolio isn't something you sell on a Tuesday afternoon. The moment a position that size hits the market, prices move. Other players see it, competitors smell blood, regulatory bodies ask questions. What looks like a number on a page is actually a web of obligations, agreements, lockup periods, and strategic commitments that make most of the wealth functionally illiquid for years at a time. You are not sitting on a pile of cash. You are sitting on a set of levers connected to other levers, and the skill isn't pulling them. It's knowing which ones not to pull. The dynasty's actual job, the thing every family office meeting and every trust amendment and every risk committee report is really about, is not growth. It's survival. Catastrophic drawdowns are the thing that ends dynasties. The family that compounds at 8% a year for 40 years but loses 60% once in a recession that catches them over-leveraged doesn't end up ahead. The entire governance structure, the diversification across asset classes and geographies, the hedging strategies, the insurance layers that most people don't even know exist at this scale, all of it is pointed at one goal. Making sure that no single event, no market crash, no political upheaval, no legal judgment, no inheritance dispute, no rogue family member can take the whole thing down at once. The family that survives isn't always the one that grew the fastest. It's the one that never had one bad enough year. So when you open your eyes for the first time in that delivery room, here's the honest version of what's true. You are not going to spend $500 billion. You are going to steward a system that was built before you arrived and is designed to outlive everyone currently in it, including you. The number is almost beside the point. What you inherited is not wealth. It's a job, a permanent, generational, consequence-laden job that started the second someone added your name to a trust document in Zurich while you were still deciding whether to cry. You didn't choose to be born on third base, but you're going to spend your entire life learning what third base actually is. You learned the difference between owning something and controlling it on a Tuesday morning in a conference room on the 43rd floor of a building your family doesn't technically own. The family office does, through a holding company, registered in Delaware, managed by a trustee whose name you'll never see in a headline. The distinction matters more than anything they taught you in the economic seminar your grandfather endowed at a university also named after your grandfather. Here's the mechanic. The $500 billion isn't controlled through cash. Cash is the least efficient tool in the whole system. Control is engineered. You hold dual-class shares in the operating companies, meaning your shares carry 10 votes where everyone else's carry 1. A pension fund can own 15% of the same company and have almost no say in how it runs. You can own 4% and run the board. The holding company above that sits another layer up, and the voting agreements between the family trusts below it mean that a room of 12 lawyers in 3 time zones have already decided how the votes will fall before the annual meeting agenda is ever printed. You don't win arguments. You build structures that make arguments unnecessary. The board seats are the part nobody talks about in public. Not because they're secret, they're in the filings if you know what you're reading, but because the leverage they represent doesn't look like leverage until you map the whole web. You sit on the board of the logistics company. That company supplies the distribution network for a consumer goods firm where your family holds a strategic minority stake. The consumer goods firm's CEO sits on the advisory council of a media group where your family office controls the anchor investment. None of those are the same company. All of them are the same conversation. That's the architecture. Not a monopoly, a constellation. Capital allocation is where the actual steering happens. When your family acquires a minority stake in an emerging freight technology company, you are not just buying an asset. You are choosing which version of the future gets funded. Roll-up strategies work the same way. You acquire 10 small regional players in a fragmented industry, standardize the back office, consolidate the purchasing power, and suddenly you have pricing leverage that none of those 10 companies had alone. You didn't invent a product, you redrew a market. Industries don't get shaped by the loudest voice in the room. They get shaped by whoever controls the capital that decides which rooms get built. The part that runs completely beneath the headline level is supply chain position. When your holding company owns a critical node in a supply chain, say a specialty chemical input that 3 different industries depend on, you are not just collecting margin. You are setting the terms other businesses have to accept to keep operating. Standard setting works the same way through consortiums. A group of capital-heavy players funds an industry body that writes the technical specifications for a new category. Those specifications happen to align with what your portfolio companies already produce. Nobody passed a law, nobody filed an antitrust complaint. The standards just got written, and the people who wrote them had seats at the table your family helped build. Then there's the cost of money itself, which is not the same number for everyone and never has been. When your family has a 40-year relationship with a private bank in Geneva and a credit history measured in decades of never missing an obligation, the interest rate on a private credit facility is a different number than what the market offers anyone else. Preferred terms, relationship banking, access to capital structures that don't get advertised because they only exist in conversations between people who already know each other. The dynasty doesn't just deploy capital at better returns. It borrows at better rates, which means every deal pencils differently before you've done a single thing except exist inside the right network. The information asymmetry is harder to see, but it might be the most valuable structural advantage in the entire system. Your family's research operation surfaces a deal 6 months before it's available to anyone outside a small circle. The broker who calls with it is calling because of a relationship that predates you. The data feeds your analysts run don't come from public sources. By the time a compelling opportunity shows up in a financial press story, your family has already evaluated it, passed on it, or closed on it. You are not competing in the same market as everyone else. You are operating in a market that opens earlier and closes later and has a shorter guest list. The dynasty name itself is collateral. In a regulatory review, the name signals that the family understands how to cooperate, has survived scrutiny before, and will still be operating in this jurisdiction in 30 years. It reduces friction in ways that don't show up on a balance sheet. A negotiation that would take an unknown acquirer 18 months closes in 6 because the counterparty already trusts the brand behind the offer. You are not just bringing capital to the table. You are bringing a century of proof that the capital stays. Your biggest decisions this year will be governance memos, voting structure amendments, board composition, A 3-page letter to a family trust committee about whether to approve a new investment policy statement. Not a shopping spree, not a yacht, a memo about who gets to vote and how many times. That's the job. That's always been the job. Control is the asset. Everything else is just what control buys. The control is only worth something if it survives you. That's the thing nobody explains until you're sitting in a room with 7 lawyers and a trust officer who's been managing family wealth since before you were born, and someone slides a document across the table that was written in 1987 and still governs what you're allowed to do with assets you nominally own. The memo didn't die with your grandfather. The structure didn't. That's the point of the whole system. You are not the dynasty. You are the current custodian of it, and your most important job isn't growing the number. It's making sure the number is still there, still structured, still protected 50 years after you're gone. The first layer of that protection is architecture. Not a single trust. A system of trusts, stacked and coordinated, each doing a specific job. Dynasty trusts in jurisdictions that don't force distributions after a fixed number of years. Family-limited partnerships that allow the senior generation to transfer economic value while retaining control of the underlying assets. Foundations that hold certain assets outside the taxable estate entirely. The jurisdictional choices matter in ways that go deeper than tax rates. You pick a state or a country, not just for what it costs, but for what its courts will and won't allow a creditor to reach. Some jurisdictions have built entire legal frameworks around the idea of protecting inherited wealth from outside claims. You don't stumble into those choices. You hire the people who've spent careers mapping them. Tax strategy at this level is a long-term process, not an annual filing. The goal isn't to avoid a specific bill. It's to shape the value, timing, and character of transfers across decades. Valuation discounts on illiquid partnership interests. Charitable lead trusts that move appreciation out of the estate while funding endowments that carry the family name. Grantor-retained annuity trusts that freeze value at one moment in time while future growth passes to the next generation outside the taxable transfer. None of this is a loophole. All of it is a deliberate, years-long coordination between lawyers, accountants, and advisors who meet quarterly and think in 30-year windows. The complexity is the moat. It takes years to build correctly and years to unwind if someone tries to challenge it. The philanthropy layer does more than one job simultaneously, and understanding all of them is how you understand why dynasties at this level treat it as infrastructure rather than charity. The endowment at the university builds goodwill in a city where your family needs operating licenses and regulatory cooperation. The hospital wing named for your grandmother creates a narrative of contribution that sits between the dynasty and any public anger about how the wealth was accumulated in the first place. Political scientists call it a license to operate. The family calls it giving back. Both things are true at the same time, and neither one cancels the other out. The foundation also employs people, funds research, and controls a pool of capital that can be directed toward causes that happen to align with industries your portfolio companies operate in. Philanthropy as PR, as relationship building, as soft influence over policy conversations. Structured correctly, it's also tax advantaged. The dynasty doesn't treat those things as contradictions. The legal moat is less visible but just as deliberately constructed. Your family retains counsel at firms that have spent decades developing relationships with the regulatory bodies that oversee the industries you operate in. When a lawsuit arrives, which it will, because operating at this scale means you will eventually be named in something, the response is calibrated before discovery starts. Settlement strategy is built around minimizing precedent, not just cost. A case that sets a bad precedent costs more than a large settlement. The family counsel knows this. They've known it longer than you've been alive. Lobbying disclosures are filed correctly, completely, publicly, because the transparency is itself a signal. We are not hiding. We know the rules. We helped write some of them. Succession is where dynasties actually fracture if they're not careful, and the families that have survived multiple generations are the ones that treated it as an engineering problem before it became an emotional one. Voting blocks formalized in documents before disagreements arose. A family council with a defined process for resolving disputes that doesn't require a judge. Heirs who want to work inside the enterprise have a track into it, but also guardrails. Performance expectations, outside experience requirements before taking a senior role. An heir who has never worked outside the family system is a liability to the whole structure. The governance documents exist precisely because the people who wrote them knew that love and money in the same room eventually produce conflict, and they wanted the conflict resolved by a pre-agreed process rather than a probate court. What happens when it breaks anyway? Dynasties that last build crisis playbooks before the crisis arrives. Reputational events get triaged by a communications team that has already mapped the response for categories of problem. Market crashes get absorbed by liquidity reserves held specifically for this purpose, structured so that a severe market correction doesn't force asset sales at the worst possible moment. Lawsuits run through the legal moat. The holding structure means a judgment against one entity doesn't reach the others. The family name survives because the name and the assets are not registered in the same place. Dax Merrill would cut Ellery's grass for 30 years and never fully see this layer. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It's the reason Ellery's plain brick ranch house exists in the same form as his grandfather left it, why no creditor has ever reached the land underneath it, why the Camry in the driveway will be replaced by another Camry driven by someone whose last name is also Voss. The real luxury at this level isn't the private jet or the art or the Loro Piana sweater with no logo. It's continuity. The machine running the same way in 2075 as it runs today, with different hands maintaining it and the same documents governing them. You are not building a fortune, you are building a structure that the fortune lives inside of. And the structure is designed to outlast everything including you. The structure outlasts you. That's the previous level. But the structure that outlasts you is also, quietly, constantly, reshaping the world that everyone else has to live inside of. That's the level most people never see because it doesn't look like power when you're standing close to it. It looks like a conference room, a policy brief, a university grant announcement, a regulatory comment letter filed on a Tuesday that nobody reads except the 12 people whose job it is to read it. And then 2 years later, an industry moves in a direction that benefits a portfolio you've held for 30 years, and the people it affects have no idea there was ever a room where the direction was, not decided exactly, but strongly suggested. This is systems-level power, and it operates on a frequency most people can't hear. The first channel is influence over policy itself. Not corruption, not envelopes. The mechanism is quieter and more durable than that. You fund a think tank that publishes rigorous economic research. The research happens to support a regulatory framework that advantages infrastructure investment over short-term speculation. Legislators cite the research. The framework passes. Your portfolio, which is weighted heavily toward long-duration infrastructure assets, benefits for the next 40 years. You didn't write the law. You funded the intellectual environment that made the law feel inevitable. Campaign contributions follow the same logic. Not buying votes. Building relationships with people who will, when the question arises, already understand your perspective because they've been briefed by people you pay to brief them. The policy becomes gravity. It pulls everything in a direction. You just happen to be standing in that direction already. The second channel is capital markets themselves. When you deploy at scale, you don't just participate in markets. You set terms. An anchor commitment to a private equity fund changes what that fund can raise from everyone else. Your presence signals quality. Other capital follows. The terms you negotiated become the floor that everyone else negotiates up from. You backstop a deal that would have died without a credible lead, and in exchange you get governance rights, information rights, anti-dilution provisions that smaller investors in the same vehicle will never see. The market didn't give you those terms. Your size did. And your size compounds because the terms you got last time made your position stronger for the next time. Philanthropy at this level is the same instrument played in a different register. The endowment you place at a research university doesn't just fund science. It funds the science that gets funded. It shapes which questions feel worth asking. A medical research initiative focused on a specific disease category, one that happens to be adjacent to a biotech position in the family portfolio, creates a pipeline of academic work that eventually validates a therapeutic approach that your holding company has already bet on. This is not conspiracy. It's alignment. The family cares about the disease. The research matters. The investment also benefits. All of those things are simultaneously true, and the family council would tell you clearly that there's nothing wrong with any of it. The critics will frame it as corruption. The dynasty frames it as vision. The difference between those two framings is a public relations infrastructure that was built years before anyone started asking the question. Media and education funding works the same way. A journalism fellowship here. A curriculum grant there. You are not telling anyone what to write or teach. You are deciding what gets resources. And resources determine what gets done. That's not a subtle point. The geopolitical layer is where the numbers get large enough that sovereign governments become counterparties rather than regulators. A major investment in a country's infrastructure doesn't just generate returns. It generates access, a seat at the table when licensing frameworks are being written. A direct line to a finance ministry that needs to understand whether the capital stays or goes depending on how a particular policy question gets resolved. Sovereign wealth funds want you in their deals because your involvement signals stability. Heads of state take the meeting because your portfolio is large enough that what you do with it is a macroeconomic variable in their planning. This is not corruption either. It's the natural consequence of operating at a scale where your decisions affect employment, tax revenue, and capital formation in entire countries. You become a stakeholder in the system at the same level as governments, and governments treat you accordingly. The ethics of all of this are genuinely complicated, and the dynasties that survive long enough to care about legacy know it. There's a legitimacy problem that compounds over time. Inequality narratives harden into political movements. Antitrust scrutiny follows concentrated capital the way it follows concentrated market share. The families that have lasted understand this not as a threat to manage, but as a real cost of operating at scale. Self-regulation isn't altruism, it's survival math. If the public story about you becomes one of extraction without contribution, the regulatory and political environment turns hostile in ways that no amount of lobbying can fully counteract. The dynasty that built a 1,000-year structure doesn't burn it down to win a decade. So the philanthropy is real, the community investment is real, the governance reform participation is real. They are also strategic. Both things always at the same time. Now here's the part that belongs to you. You are not managing a $500 billion dynasty, but the playbook scales down further than people realize. Build assets, even small ones, before you optimize lifestyle. Protect the downside before you chase the upside, because the families that lasted weren't the ones who grew fastest, they were the ones who lost least when things broke. Use your time horizon as a weapon. The advantage of not having quarterly earnings calls is available to anyone who doesn't manufacture artificial urgency in their own finances. And invest in skills and relationships the same way a dynasty invests in political capital, slowly, deliberately, with a 30-year return in mind instead of a 30-day one. The dynasty playbook isn't about the number, it's about the architecture around the number. And you can start building architecture at any balance. Which level of power surprised you most? Drop it in the comments below and subscribe, because this is the kind of finance nobody explains straight.